Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the Arraya Solutions Vodcast. As in previous episodes, we've assembled a group of leading experts in their field. Today, we will be discussing cybersecurity. Let me introduce our panel. I'm Scott Brion, Arraya's Cybersecurity Director, and with me today, I have Mike Piekarski, our Enterprise Security Architect, and Keith Wood, Cybersecurity Consultant. Thanks for joining us today, guys.
Thanks, Scott.
Hey, let's just get right into it and start talking about, what we've been going through the last 7 days in this Log4j vulnerability. Keith, what, a lot of news has been coming in. What did you start giving your clients advice about it initially when this vulnerability was released? And, how's that changed as we've learned more about it?
Initially it was, all hands on deck, inventory of assets. Do you know if you have systems that are vulnerable? What's your presence from the outside? Really kind of kicking it off that way with really, understanding what your impact or the risk to your environment is. And then kind of slowing a little bit down to cooler heads prevailing, and not henny penny, the sky is falling kind of a response, but to more of, we still have to keep the lights on and do our day jobs, but still manage the risk of this vulnerability. And as patches are coming out, just applying patches and keeping an eye out for, the changes as they develop with, different vectors and changes to the vulnerability itself.
Mike, with that, what, from your perspective, what makes supporting customers, chasing down this vulnerability and shrinking their attack surface, what makes it such a challenge with this specific vulnerability? We've heard a lot of comparisons to shell shock and how this is, put the internet on fire. Maybe give me your perspective on technically, why it is such a big deal, and a little window into how it's affecting so many OEM manufacturers.
Sure. It's tough because it's inline code execution from basically any field or variable that's parsed by Log4j, and depending on the product, how it's using Log4j, it's hard to predict what is actually being parsed by it unless you know the product or the stack, or it was an in-house developed piece of software. And a lot of people, they might buy product X from vendor and not know that it's built on a bunch of open source libraries like this. So the number one thing, we were talking about it before, me and Keith, just the user agent of the client device is where a lot of these things, the strings that are exploiting the vulnerability, are being injected. So for those not familiar with what that is, it's any request that's made to a web server and the browser identifying itself, that's where it's going. So it's not, a lot of ransomware campaigns are coming from a specific set of command and control servers, or they have specific file hashes. This is a string that could be permutated in a number of ways in any number of inputs and trickled into a system that's using Log4j. So it's not necessarily this threat actor, this list of IOCs. There are threat feeds that are correlating them as the attacks are observed, but you're a little behind the 8 ball trying to block things, block hosts or file hashes. And as we just saw, I think it was Cloudflare just did a write-up like 4 or 5 days ago of the web application firewall bypass techniques, where they're kind of changing the strings and using the native parsing language to obfuscate the strings, so that if you're looking for JNDI, there's ways to easily bypass those string matches. So it makes it difficult to detect exactly where it is, and it also, when we may have 30 products from 5 different vendors, it makes it hard to find out exactly which products are affected. I'm sure, throughout the week, we were getting updates as late as a couple days ago of latest products that vendors were realizing depended upon it. So not everybody knows, and it's been developing all week. There's just not enough information up front.
Yeah, so I think that's something that makes this interesting, right? In that I was comparing it a little bit to Bluekeep in that when it hit the wire, it was immediately exploitable, and it was doing something in a way that we really hadn't seen before. But that was a specific OEM. That was Microsoft, right? They could put a patch out. You could patch the Bluekeep vulnerability. Even though it kept popping back up, we knew exactly where it lived, what OSs it lived in, what software we had to watch out for. But this one has the I feel like it's going to be showing up in pen tests for the next decade, right? That pen testers and red teamers are going to be popping and gaining access because a Log4j 2.14, 2.15 vulnerability was found that was left there from some app that was installed right in 2020, and hadn't been updated since, or some whatever. So Mike, to that point, this really has this has changed the game for us, right? Where there's these third-party products that have this vulnerability embedded in them. Our users and customers of these products have to depend on these OEMs to release patches, even though there's fixes for the Log4j vulnerability. The OEM manufacturers have to incorporate those fixes right into their patches and then release those patches and make sure that it doesn't affect their software. That all takes time, and meanwhile, attackers are leveraging this and monetizing this. So this brought up a topic we all discussed a little bit earlier, about the ability to actually patch the vulnerability by exploiting the vulnerability. And it opens the door for a lot of discussions about what law enforcement, what the IT community, what responsibilities that we have or don't have to fix and patch these vulnerable pieces of software when the users of them don't even know the vulnerabilities are there.
Right, but that transcends a technical issue into an ethics issue, and that's where you're going to get a varying array of opinion. I've got customers that immediately jumped on these vulnerabilities and started looking for patches and patching systems, taking systems offline because there was no patch available for it yet. I have others that, I'm not affected. Well, do you know what you have? Yeah, it's not here, and really minimal effort to really seek and destroy the vulnerability. So it runs the gamut, and I don't know. I mean, are you allowed to walk in my house because I left the door unlocked?
Right. Yeah, that's the question, right? Is it so? The FBI, as we know, actually fixed and patched vulnerable Exchange servers back in 2021, like March, I think, of 2021, when that major Exchange vulnerability came out, and the Chinese were actively exploiting it through January and February of 2021. We found out later that the FBI was using, again, that same vulnerability that made these Exchange servers vulnerable to patch and fix the Exchange servers. From that perspective, they treated that like a national security issue, right? Like a stability situation, because those Exchange servers were being leveraged as attack platforms. I guess we could just open the door the door to talk about opinions, right? So where do you guys sit on the role of law enforcement and government, specifically in the United States, when it comes to the technical elements, hacking elements that we're talking about?
I'll go first. I think it's a very slippery slope. I mean, we've all, at least the three of us, we've all done engineering for a large majority of our careers, and every system, every environment is unique unto itself. And just because there's a known vulnerability, it doesn't necessarily mean that every system is configured the same and the fix is the same. You could apply a fix to my system that brings a whole bunch of other things down that has a very detrimental effect to my organization, my operation. And even though your intentions were there to do good, you actually inflicted a lot of bad upon me. So do I have recourse then? Or can you stand behind the fact that you were trying to do the right thing and you were a good Samaritan, so you should be immune from any recourse that I would have to recoup damages that I incurred because of your actions?
It's kind of like we all hope that everybody has insurance and has their car inspected, right? When we're driving on the road and the highway with our families. But we know they don't.
Right.
We know there's a lot of people that don't. There's a lot of safety issues, a lot of accidents that can be avoided. But the government doesn't fix your car for you, right? It just inspects it and tells you if you can go on the road or not. But we don't even do that for systems, right?
Right. Well, the other piece there is, I think, for this analogy, it would be the government buckling your seatbelt for you.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like,
Well, I'm thinking about it. Would it be though, or would it be them checking to make sure you have airbags, or that the airbags work?
What's the guarantee the agent they're using to check those, to make sure those airbags are working, is doing what they're supposed to do?
Yeah.
I hear you, and I didn't mean to. Sorry to interrupt you, Mike. I think it's there's totally arguments on both sides. I guess as I depend on the internet, my livelihood, my family, the future, my plans for my life and my family's future, it all involve the internet. It is interesting that there is no there's no test, right? There's no validation to connect to. You can plug anything into it you want.
There is a trade-off, right? So without getting too political about it, once you give that power to an organization, call it whatever federal organization you want, you can't take it back.
Right.
And in order for change to actually occur, pain has to be felt. So for the market or the individual customers to actually make the corrections that are required, sometimes some catastrophic failures have to happen. And if we have daddy government saving us from that, then we're just going to be in a hamster wheel of ever applying Band-Aids and preventing people from feeling that pain, in my opinion. And the slippery slope there is, a couple fold, but I don't like setting the precedent that the same thing that I would go to jail for performing, the government has leeway to do. I think they should be treated the same as me.
No, I agree. And so when really what you end up talking about, right, is additional networks, right? So the internet's going to always be the internet. It's going to be the bad neighborhood, the war zone, the place that you don't want your kids to go alone, and the place that even is a little scary to be alone by yourself. And then, but connecting, businesses are going to have to start making different choices than necessarily using the internet, right, for their connectivity in a lot of ways, because of how much risk it poses to them. Like, if you can open a small store in Montclair, New Jersey, and sell gift shops, tea store, or whatever, and your risk of being robbed is significantly low, right? In Montclair, New Jersey, selling tea. But now, once you add that store and you have an internet storefront, your risk of getting robbed is significantly higher, because you're now doing business on the internet.
Right, but I mean, we all accept a certain amount of risk in our lives, and it's a personal choice, right? I could buy a really old car that has very few safety features and get from point A to point B, just like buying a super fancy car that has all the bells and whistles, 5-star crash test rating to get from A to B.
Yeah, I guess
a certain amount of risk to do the things that we want to do.
And if you're driving a fancy car without insurance and you total it, that's on you. You accept the risk. You accept the responsibility. It's up to you to perform the due diligence to protect you and your organization. So having some outside body come and protect you and save the day. I mean, we don't live in a Marvel universe.
I'm not suggesting to your point about separate networks. Like, that's like saying truck drivers have their own roads that no one else is allowed to be on, right? To provide a level of protection and flow. I mean, that'd be great for the supply chain problem right now if they had their, enough truckers on separate designated roads. But that that's not a reality. So to have separate networks, a separate internet, who's going to control that?
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is I think we're seeing that. I think we're seeing the market create that, right? I think that, like Amazon, for instance, right? They run their own network. Their network, they can operate their business safely on their network because they control and they run it, right? To use your fancy car analogy, if you have a nice race car and you want to see how well it can do, right? You're not going to take it out on the highway. You're going to take it to a closed track. You're going to run it, in Amazon's track, right? in their nice tuned protected area. And I'm not suggesting that the internet don't get me wrong, should have some test or check to get attached to it. What I'm suggesting is that the market's accounting for that, right? The market with the cloud, the individual IaaS providers, the cloud access connection capability, cloud access security brokers, companies like Zscaler and Netscope that provide secure tunnels right into the cloud, right into your tenants. This is where the connectivity market's going, and what I'm getting at is, on the law enforcement side, what makes it interesting then is really more and more what's with the companies that are doing business directly on the internet are less and less capable, right? Because the ones that are capable aren't actually using the internet to operate their business. They have cloud servers, they have private networks, closed, controlled, protected networks, and they expose themselves very lightly to the internet. Does that make sense?
It does, but I mean, that's part of the pro of, cloud services. I can stand up a website on GoDaddy with WordPress as my back end to present all of my content, my store, everything. Squarespace, you can stand up a website in 30 minutes. And security? What are you talking? Right. It's built in. It's part of my plan.
Well, and now if it's running there too, right, and you have it in the right plan, you can even determine what countries are allowed to connect to that website. And,
right, but it's up to the user, isn't it?
Sure, 100%. Yeah.
Right. So it's, it all falls back on that consumer or the consumer. Whether you're a business or an individual, you're still a consumer of these services, and you have to accept responsibility to buckle your seatbelt, to drive in the slow lane if you don't want to, risk being in the, you've got to accept this responsibility. So as a CIO or a manager of an IT department, you have to accept the responsibility that there are things you need to do to protect your assets. IT isn't a separate part of the business. It is the business. It's as integral as every other department today. And we keep thinking in buckets of different, IT is IT, and that's an IT problem. No, it's a business problem. It's not an IT problem. Risk is a business problem, and it needs to start being thought that way.
The other part of that is, just because you operate a business that relies on technology doesn't mean you have to maintain your own systems. That's kind of where we're going. I mean, we have clients that don't have servers. They only have SaaS-based products. They are not on the hook to fix these types of things. Right. Their providers are. And so that helps you offset that risk. You pay for a service who performs that for you.
But the risk of that is being vulnerable until they fix it.
Yeah, fair. I mean, but it's still, it's either that or you're going to have to pay to maintain those systems. And this is one of the vulnerabilities that you would have to maintain.
Right, but that's
all of the other ones throughout.
That's one of the checks and balances of a cloud solution, right? They don't want the bad reputation of not being secure, not fixing their problems in a timely fashion, which then they lose customers, right? People are going to move on to someone else that's providing the same service at a more secure manner, right? So it's a check and balance that's there, but still a risk nonetheless.
Fair.
Yeah, I mean, and so, that kind of gets into, we could maybe use that to transition to like 2022, predictions, right? So, one of my predictions for 22 is that, the IaaS, the infrastructure as a service providers, specifically Azure, Google, and Amazon, that there will be a lot more offerings to connect directly to their environments, to their networks, right? So using ISPs like Comcast Business, for instance, or Verizon Business, Windstream, to be able to just go right into your cloud environment without going over the internet, without creating VPNs. I know that's pretty broadly available now with like SD-WAN and things like that, but I think it's going to be pretty much standard, where orgs are just going to have their connectivity to the cloud a lot of times maintained by their carriers, their network carriers. It's one of my predictions. The other prediction I have, I think that Microsoft and Amazon will come to some interconnectivity agreement for their networks. They'll have some back end where they can connect to each other. You won't be forced to go over the internet to connect Microsoft to Amazon. From a cybersecurity perspective, I think we talked about this a little bit, but with what's going on in Ukraine, the big news in 2022 is going to be cybersecurity, cyber warfare mixed with traditional warfare on the battlefield. Those are my 2022 predictions. Okay. What about you, Keith? What do you got?
My predictions are, I think we're going to see a lot more Log4j type vulnerabilities where, it's open source, it's used all over the place where we may not necessarily know it is, and there is an array of attack methods because of these vulnerabilities. Log4j is interesting because, it might be used in a product where there's no obvious way to exploit it, but there's a whole world of people that's all they're doing. They're standing up virtual machines to understand how the technology is used in these products to figure out an exploit. So I think, there's a whole market for this. I think that's blooming, on the dark net, that, it's just a whole nother industry. I think that's growing and will continue to grow even more in 2022 to support, a whole like a store of exploits for vulnerabilities that may not even be public, wider sharing of vulnerability information.
Yeah, I'm kind of in agreement with both. I think the direction of the industry, vaguely the industry at large, whatever, has been layers of abstraction, and getting away from the users, specifically like the technical staff having to have expertise in the underlying technology. So I think we'll be seeing more and more layers. Like Kubernetes was like huge for the past couple of years, and containers at large are getting larger and larger, but Kubernetes is another layer on top of that. We might see another layer on top of that. Like you're saying with the service, the ISP level integration, like a fractional direct connect or however that would work, that again takes you away from having to maintain your line directly into the point of presence that has a line directly into Amazon's data center. I think we'll see a lot of those things, but with each one of those services or that offering, you add in vulnerabilities because you are no longer maintaining the underlying infrastructure. And with the emergence of all of these containerized platforms and more software that's built with languages that, just to put out a simple script or simple platform, you might have 200 open source packages as dependencies. I'm right there with you, Keith, where the open source vulnerabilities are going to continue to get larger and larger, and especially in those containerized environments where there's not the right tooling in place. So I think that will lead to an increase in DevSecOps and automation, whether that's configuration management, things like Terraform, and people building their own build servers to host their own mirrors for things, and do their own sanity checks so they can tell exactly what packages they have out there. Right now, they just know what their apps are, and they don't necessarily have an inventory of all of the other libraries they're built on. But all it takes is a few of these types of critical vulnerabilities to hit, to where development shops now have to go through and find out exactly what they're made out of and patch all those vulns. And
there's a whole movement for bill of materials, software bill of materials, being like have a requirement to disclose the open source software that you're using in your products.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of this tooling already exists. The adoption just isn't there.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting too, right? As far as the view that Log4j gave us, right? And how many, to your point, Keith, how many OEMs are affected? The threat community or the community looking for these exploits, right? They just got wise to an entirely probably unknown, not necessarily unknown, but necessarily the amount of value in this Log4j 0 day reveals, right, how much there is, how much meat's on the table if you go out and hunt for these open source vulnerabilities and these packages that are embedded, to your point, in all these products. Like, digging in and specifically going after these little modules inside of Apache struts a month ago might not have been someone's idea of a way to make money, right, or find a way in. But
well, it's gig work, right? I mean, how many professional security guys might develop an exploit or figure out an exploit and go sell it on the dark web anonymously?
I mean,
that's gig work, right?
What if SolarWinds was incorporating open source libraries, right, into its platform? They wouldn't have had to hack the supply chain. I think it would have just had to hack the they wouldn't have had to figure out a way to get an engineer hired. Let's put it that way. They could have just contributed to the Apache library and waited for time to catch up. And I wonder, is that what happened here? There's no way of knowing that.
Well, this is what happened with Heartbleed, where it was uncovered. I can't remember the amount of contributors at the time, but the OpenSSL project was down to a handful of contributors who just were overwhelmed. And what software doesn't use OpenSSL? You know what I mean?
Right.
So in that respect, Log4j is way lower impact than it could have been if it was a larger adopted library.
Here's an interesting thought. How many developers you think go on Fiverr or other gig type platforms and, hey, I need code for, putting widget A in box B.
Oh my God.
Farms it out and never checks the code that's sent in, and they incorporate it in their big company name project.
You know what's huge for that? Human interface design. Mm-hmm. Any all the GUI stuff. Developers, nobody ever wants to build their own because it's very time consuming, and they also don't want to pay for it because they don't think it's important because it's GUI and they're all about the code. So a lot of times the GUI code is pretty dirty. I've run into that before.
But so, I mean, you're talking about putting an opening on Fiverr, but we're talking about projects that live on GitHub.
Right. It's really not much different, is it?
Who is analyzing the pull requests? You know what I mean? So if there is not some sort of, I don't want to use all the buzzwords, but like shift left, like the inline DevSecOps checks on the code that's being committed and manual reviews being performed. And when you're talking about maybe like a 3-man or 5-man team who are just developers that have full-time jobs that are doing this out of the kindness of their heart, and then
pure nerdyhood. Yeah.
So are you saying that the end of security through obscurity is over? That we actually have to look and check and validate?
I mean, I think it's larger than that, and I think it's just like the supply chain has been the buzzword, right? But our open source world is the supply chain. Every company is eventually getting to the point where, or every large company that manages their own infrastructure is basically a development shop, and they are built on open source packages and libraries. And nobody is checking when you are using a package that inherits a package that has 500 dependencies of its own. They might check one or two layers of that, but they're not looking downstream to see all of them. And until that changes, and we can't, until we consider that part of our supply chain as well on a mass scale, then this type of thing's not going to get fixed.
So not zero trust when it comes to open source packages.
Yeah, I mean, unless you want to build all of your own libraries and maintain them, there has to be some level of trust. But there's tooling to put in place to automate it, but it's almost impossible at this level if you are using some sort of abstraction libraries.
That was Microsoft's talk track in 2004 when they were trying to fight Linux in the enterprise.
Yeah, well,
they were like, no, you don't want all your stuff out there for everyone to read. It's not secure. We're not secure. Microsoft's not secure. Oh, imagine having all your code out there in a repository that anybody could read and update. That's not secure.
Right.
Well, I think all of this really highlights what's been there from the beginning. It's a layered security approach that you have checks and balances at every level. And, I think we've all fallen into this in our careers where we look at it and we're like, oh, that's ridiculous. There's so much effort there. Or we can't financially support that process. Or that would require more people than I have available to put that effort in. But I think we continually prove this point that this old school classic layered security approach of checks and balances, zero trust is what it ultimately comes down to. It works.
Yeah,
when we move away from that, we get burned.
I think we're just uncovering as we go forward and the market shifts and changes the way that things work. There's new layers being added.
Right. Right.
Like, and we're always going to be behind. So it doesn't matter. We talk about this a lot, like just the differences in the layers and the approach for cloud versus on-prem. It's still the same principles. It's just the layers and the services and the mechanisms to apply those principles changes. And as they get more and more mature, they bake in some of those places to check those layers or to add your own protections in.
Right, but even as a new technology that we don't fully understand, we have the intelligence and the ability to put checks at, limit that blast zone, right? Like segmenting off a newer technology so it just doesn't have full and open access to back-end secrets or special data, right? Only allow it to access what it needs. I think there's certain controls that we can still put in place without fully understanding the ability of a newer technology. And I think, the shiny new thing gets all the attention, the broad stage, and we tend to forget the fundamentals and start going too fast for our own good, and it bites us.
Yeah, and I think to that point, right? I mean, what we learned is that if you want to be prepared and you want to respond to zero-day vulnerabilities, having your application inventory, having your device inventory, and having your controls, your security control inventory documented and up to date is the most important thing that you can do on a day-to-day basis. There isn't a tool that you could have purchased or a product you could have owned that you could have bought that day that would have helped you combat it, right? But there were a lot of activities that you could have done in advance of that day, things that we've been recommending and championing as an industry since you could call cybersecurity an industry. Inventory your assets, track your applications, get your points of contact, have all your support, your software and hardware support contracts in place, and understand your escalation paths.
Right, it's your classic compliance frameworks: NIST CSF, NIST 853, CIS.
Yep.
First set of controls, policy and procedure, and asset management.
Yeah, the shops that had everything buttoned up and had tight inventory, they knew what they could turn off if they had to, and what would be impacted if they did, and so on. So yeah, I mean that's what I think is another attack, another 0 day, another exploit, another big internet news cycle week, and interesting again that the way to be in front of this would have been you could have gone back to the initial NIST frameworks. You could have gone back to the initial CIS top 20, and nothing that has been added into any of those frameworks or those control guidelines over the last 10 years would have been needed to help be in front of this Log4j thing. And I think that's important to remember, is that it's still very basic when it comes to responding to these things. Great, guys. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks, Mike and Keith. I think this was a very interesting discussion. Thanks for all your opinions and ideas. Thank you to all of our viewers. We appreciate you taking the time to listen, and we hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to take a look at previous Vodcast episodes, as well as Arraya's expert Q&A series on arrayasolutions.com or our YouTube channel. Thanks, and see you next time.